We are talking LA Kings and the trade deadline and more with Austin Stanovich of the Sporting Tribune on this edition of Locked On LA Kings.
You are Locked On Kings, your daily podcast on the Los Angeles Kings. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, Kings fans, welcome to Locked On LA Kings, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for making Locked On LA Kings your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. I'm Eddie Garcia, your host of Locked On LA Kings. I've worked in sports media for the past 30 years, also co-host of the Puck Podcast, a weekly NHL review show that's been putting out content for the last 18 years, and a passionate LA Kings fan for over 30 years. Joining us today is a fairly frequent guest on the show. We are happy to welcome back Austin Stanovich. He is a columnist for the Sporting Tribune, and he is a great follow on X Twitter at @Stanovich68. Well-informed, solid opinions, and he is very interactive with his followers. So if you're on there, you need to follow him for sure. Austin, welcome back to the show. Thanks for doing this. How are you?
Yeah, of course, Eddie. I'm always happy to come on. Always have a blast coming on here talking Kings hockey with you.
I'll appreciate it. We'll talk a little bit about how the Kings are playing right now. Not so great, but obviously the trade deadline's the big story this week. Friday, 3 p.m. Eastern time. And before we kind of get into maybe what the Kings will do or what they're thinking of doing, maybe we should start with where the Kings are and kind of what they're looking to accomplish this season. And of course, that includes looking at the person in charge, which is GM Rob Blake, who's been on the job since April of 2017. 4 playoff appearances, no playoff series wins to this point. He's not known for his trade deadline deals. He usually makes his big splashes in the offseason. Most noteworthy deadline deal, probably Vladislav Gavrikov and Jonas Korpisalo back in 2023. And they say that the past tells you what has happened, not what will happen. But given his history of what he's done, what are you expecting him to do at the deadline this year?
Yeah, not a ton, honestly. I think that's even less so to do with like Rob Blake's history and what he maybe wants to do, and more just what they're able to do. Fans obviously want the big move. I know the reports that they did check in on Mikko Rantanen and that kind of stuff, and that gets people excited. But there just isn't a lot for them to do. I like to use the words available and affordable, and there aren't many guys that fit that mold for the Kings that are really going to be able to put them over the top. And I think that there are a lot of trades that they probably won't want to. They're only going to make like a big trade if it's going to, in their eyes, put them over the top. And I just don't think that that player is going to be both available and affordable to them. You hear the names. There's some exciting ones out there like Brock Besser in Vancouver, but the Canucks aren't trading Brock Besser to a division rival during a playoff race. Rickard Rakell in Pittsburgh, they don't need to sell. He's asking prices of first and a blue chip prospect. The Kings don't have those kind of assets to pour into guys like that. So I think that I just don't expect a big splash. I'm sure we'll see a move, but it'll probably be, I think Pierre LeBrun said the Kings are looking for a single, not a home run. I think that's a perfect way to put it. That's what I'd expect from them.
Yeah, I would say if you're looking at Rob Blake, he's a singles hitter. He is not a guy swinging from the heels for the fences, most likely. But I do want to ask this, and I know you can't answer this, but your opinion on the fact that he's in the final year of his contract.
Yeah.
And I would think that his fate is tied to this team's postseason success. Do you think that that could contribute or affect his decision-making in any way at the deadline?
Maybe. I mean, it's hard to know for sure. I've always kind of, I shouldn't say I've always thought. I know Elliot Friedman reported last year that he had the understanding that the kind of things he was hearing is that Rob Blake was planning on maybe walking away this year no matter what happened. Like he was kind of done at the end of this contract. So I don't know if we might not be looking at a guy who's fighting for his job here if he's planning on walking away anyway. So I'm not as worried about a panic deal trying to save his job or anything. I also think that they have a kind of a structure in LA with Luke Robitaille maybe being more involved in the hockey side of things now that they wouldn't just let that kind of thing happen. They're ideally planning for the future with kind of a foundation there. So it's always possible, of course. I don't expect to see like a trying to save my job kind of move from Rob Blake though.
When you look at the Kings and their goals for this season, I think it's fair to say, I mean, I know every team will say, well, our goal is to win the Stanley Cup. And of course, there are various things you do to get to there. You can't go from A to Z, or first, there's steps along the way. But I would say the Kings going into the season, they were just looking for progress. They were looking for things to be better. Obviously, getting a first round series win. With that in mind, is that also play into kind of what they're looking to do maybe at the deadline?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the minimum for them is getting out of the first round. I mean, I think truly that internally they think that they are a potential, dark horse cup candidate. I mean, just what we've heard from them. We heard at the end of last season, Luke Robitaille talking about being right there in a series against the Oilers. Whether or not you agree with that, it doesn't,
Yeah.
doesn't really matter, because if that's how they view themselves, that's how they're going to make their decisions. Obviously, you always take everything that's said in the media right after a tough loss with a grain of salt, but I do think that they internally view this team as closer to contendership than maybe a lot of the fans and media do, honestly.
It's funny you say that, because if they really feel that way, you think that they might make a
Yeah.
bigger deal, right? But
Yeah.
as you said, it's not always as easy as that might seem. I did want to ask you, are you relatively confident that the Kings are going to make the playoffs? And are you relatively confident it's going to be either Vegas or Edmonton in the first round?
Yeah, I'd say definitely. I think this team's a playoff team. I don't really. I mean, things would have to go horribly wrong between now and the start and game 83 for them not to make the playoffs. I think they're pretty secure in there. Got a lot of home games in the season. We know their home record is what it is. They kind of rake it home. I do think, though, it's going to be one of Edmonton or Vegas. With the way Edmonton's playing, maybe it's
Mhm.
home ice advantage against Edmonton, which could be a difference maker for this Kings team. But I mean, it kind of feels like we're heading right for a crash course to 4 years in a row against the Oilers in round one, unless something drastically changes in the standings.
And in your mind, would beating one of those two teams in the first round, would that be progress for the Kings? I mean, is that good enough? I mean, I know as a fan, you set the bar at a certain place, and it seems like just getting a first round playoff win isn't all that impressive. But I guess considering, like I said, the success they've had in the playoffs under Blake, what it's been 3 years in a row, if that were to happen, you're like, okay, that's a step in the right direction. That's progress.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely progress. Is it good enough? I don't know. That'll also be determined by what they do by the end of this week. Like, I don't think that they're going to do it, but a hypothetical alternate universe, if they trade Brant Clark to try and make a run and then they just win one round, that's not good enough. You can't make that kind of move and then only win one round, kind of like making the Pierre-Luc Dubois move and then not winning a playoff round. Like, it's kind of the expectations also get set by the moves that they're going to make this week. But yes, I mean, if you get out of the first round, you have made progress. I hesitate to say good enough, because they've spent 3 years trying to build this team to be something that could be more than that. To hang your hat on, like, we finally did it after at least 2 years of trading away future assets to make this team better now, feels a little kind of like patting yourself on the back for something you maybe don't deserve. So good enough, I guess, is subjective. Progress certainly, though.
We're just getting started with Austin Stanovich. We'll get into some specific names. He's mentioned a couple of them already. We'll do that next here on Locked On LA Kings, your team every day. Hey, NBA action is just getting going, and there's no better place to get in on that action than FanDuel. It's America's #1 sports book. With FanDuel, you can place a live bet throughout the game, and even if you miss the opening tip-off or you want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can always stay in on the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets for a same-game parlay. FanDuel's live betting feature keeps you invested in every moment of the game and keeps it exciting, whether you're backing your team for a late game rally or picking a player to hit a clutch three-pointer. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, we are continuing with Austin Stanovich. And Austin, you mentioned a couple of names, and I've thrown out a few names as well. Guys that I think could be potential difference makers, but obviously these aren't superstar players either. And we've, heard, and it makes sense about, a right-handed shot, a top six forward, a guy who can help scoring and power play. Jonathan Marchessault of Nashville is the name I brought up. I haven't heard anything about him being moved, which makes me think it's going to happen. Alex Tuck in Buffalo. You mentioned Rickard Rakell in Pittsburgh and Brock Besser in Vancouver. Are any of those players the type of players that are realistic for the Kings at this point?
I don't know if I'd use the term realistic, like just going through the list. Like I said earlier, Brock Besser, I just don't envision a world where the Canucks are willing to trade him to the Kings because they're, essentially fighting for a similar spot in the playoffs, a similar spot in the standings. Unless you're drastically overpaying for that guy, I don't think they're going to send him to the Kings. Rickard Rakell would be a great pickup, but again, Pittsburgh doesn't have to sell on that guy. They're not in any kind of rush to move him. It doesn't sound like he's going up into Dubas's office and demanding a trade, so they hold all the chips there, and I don't think that the Kings are going to be willing to part with the kind of assets that it would take to get him. Like a lot of people say, "Oh, just give him a first round pick and Trevor Moore." They're not going to take a first round pick and Trevor Moore for a Carter Kell. It wouldn't make sense
Right.
for them.
Right.
Like Alex Tuck, I don't envision a world where he gets moved at all, regardless. Again, unless you're offering something crazy for the Kings, you're offering like Quentin Byfield or Brant Clark for that guy, and I don't think anyone wants to because again, they don't have to trade him. They're not in any rush. He's not demanding a trade or anything. Marchessault's the interesting one. He'd be a really good add to this team. That contract term just it's kind of brutal for that guy. Like you're paying him for a long time. The back end of that's going to look rough. That's the kind of trade where if you give significant assets to get that guy, you have to win now. Like you can't hang your hat on a first round win when you move significant assets to get a guy on that kind of contract. So like all those guys would make this team a lot better. Again, it's the affordable and available equation that I just don't see it happening for any of those guys.
Is there any of the names you have? I know I've mentioned kind of a step down from those guys like Kyle Palmieri or Oliver
Yeah.
Bjorkstrand or any of those guys. Is that a little more realistic?
I think that's probably the guys that Rob Blake and the Kings front office are targeting because they, like you mentioned, Kyle Palmieri definitely would improve this team. I don't know if he's good enough to get them over that hump, but without a doubt, you add a 20 plus goal right shot guy to the top six, and he definitely improves the team. Same with Bjorkstrand. I don't know if he's available. I really like Morgan Geekie out of Boston, who's having a really good year. So I think that those are the guys that you're targeting. Palmieri is the one that, if it happened, would be the least surprising to me. If the
I
Islanders
agree.
are willing to sell on him, you could probably get that guy as a rental on pretty cheap if you can get him for, a third round pick. That deal makes a lot of sense for the Kings. Like I think if you make that deal, it's a very good deal for the Kings. Whether or not it leads to anything, changing their fortunes this year, I don't know. But again, certainly improves this team. I think if he's available, he's also potentially affordable for this team.
I know you're active on social media and you see a lot of the comments. And I guess I mentioned you interact with a lot of the people out there. Brant Clark being a healthy scratch a lot lately.
Yeah.
What is your read on all of this? I know some people have speculated maybe that makes him in play here. I don't believe that, but um, is there any real concern for you over what's going on with him right now? I know if they're playing seven defensemen, I don't understand why he wouldn't be at least the seventh defenseman, but I don't have a big issue with Jordan Spence in the moment getting the playing time over Brant Clark, but it seems like a lot of people are very concerned and very upset about this. Are you?
So before the last game where he was a scratch and they played seven defensemen, I wouldn't have used the term concerned. I don't know if I'm quite there yet, but that was a concerning thing for me. Like before that, I didn't necessarily agree with it. I understood why there were six defensemen playing above him. I could like squint and see the logic behind what was happening. I think that Brant Clark is one of the six best defensemen on this team. I think he should be playing more. I got why he wasn't. Then you see Kyle Burrows come to the lineup and Brant Clark scratching at 11-7 setup, and that one I can't understand. I can't figure out the logic behind that. So that's where it's maybe a little bit concerning for me. But I also think this is not good for Brant Clark's development, obviously. I don't think anyone can make any kind of argument that this is anything but bad for his development. Jim Hiller even said after the game he played 5 minutes. Obviously, that's not good for any player. We don't want that for him, that kind of thing. But his long-term development isn't going to be ruined by a 3 month stretch where he isn't playing very much. Like he's a good enough player where he will find a way to become who he's going to become. I think he can. I've used the phrase succeeding in spite of, not because of, sometimes with certain Kings prospects. I think Brant Clark is that level of player that he's just too good to fail. But man, it's hard to. We'll see what happens tonight against St. Louis. That can also change. But man, if we see him scratched again and 7 defensemen playing above him, it's hard not to get a little bit concerned, because obviously there's something that this coaching staff really doesn't like or doesn't trust about Brant Clark. And how much is that going to change 6 months from now at the start of next season? Potentially a lot, or it's not, or it's something that they just, his player type, whatever it is, they just are never going to really come around to, and then I think it gets concerning. So alarm bells for sure. Anytime you see a guy like Brant Clark get scratched behind 7 other defensemen, I think it's a little bit concerning. I don't think that we're in like, break glass in case of emergency. We have a full blown disaster here yet, though.
I got invited by a season ticket holder to join him for this lunch with Luke. That's Kings president, Luke Robitaille. And he was pretty honest about a lot of things. And he was talking about maybe at the deadline, the Kings adding another type of player to make them harder to play against, kind of what they did during the offseason. And I know you wrote about this recently, about a depth forward, not necessarily maybe a top 6 forward. I know a couple of those guys are already, that you wrote about, are already off the list. Jake Evans, the Canadians, re-signed with the team, and Trent Frederick of the Bruins got traded to the Oilers. Any other players, though, that you could see, if they can't get that top 6 type of guy, that they'd be looking to add that depth forward to help, down the lineup?
Yeah, I like Michael McCarron out of Nashville. He's a really big center. He's good in the faceoff circle. He can kill penalties. He can do a lot of those things that coaches really like, coaches kind of admire. And I think that would be a pretty big help for this Kings team. I know it's not, it's not a sexy move. It's not a move that gets fans really excited, but having the fourth line is clearly a problem for this team, right? I don't think that they have 12 forwards that the coaching staff trusts enough to play consistently, which is a problem. They like the 11-7 setup. They've liked it for a while now, but I think that in a perfect world, they would have 12 forwards that they trusted to play every night, and adding a Michael McCarron type could fix that problem and maybe take a little bit of stress off the top of their lineup, because Jim Hiller's talked about liking the ability to really run some of the guys that are going hot, but across an 82 game season into the playoffs, that starts to break you down. And I think we're seeing some of the guys on this Kings team maybe start to slow down a little bit because they've been working really hard. So that's kind of what, again, unless you can get a Kyle Palmieri for really cheap, I wouldn't pay a big price for like a top 6 or top 9 winger. I'd be targeting a guy like, I really like Trent Frederick before Edmonton got him. I think that's a really good move for them. I think it would have been a great move for the Kings. So that mold of player, I think, is what I would be going for more than anything, just because, again, I think opportunity cost there makes the most sense for this Kings team.
I can't imagine they're looking to add anything defensively, but who knows? It depends on what's out there. But there is some concern, certainly, with the backup goalie of late.
Yeah.
David Riddick has had his issues. Is that something also that you might see them address, you think?
I don't know if I would expect them to address it. I think it would be, depending on the cost, a smart thing to address. David Riddick has really struggled this year. I mean, maybe depends on how confident they are and how Phoenix Copley's been playing in Ontario. I haven't seen a lot of the rain this year, so if you're pretty confident he can come up and be like a serviceable backup, maybe you don't move any assets and just kind of roll with that. I think that would be understandable. But yeah, I mean, this team's, and I think this is true for a lot of teams, but if Darcy Kemper, if their starter gets hurt, I mean, just pack it up. Like, this team isn't going anywhere with David Riddick and net with the way he's played this year. We saw him play pretty well last year, but we haven't seen that this season. And you mentioned the blue line. I agree. I don't think there's going to be a move. I think if there was, it would be something that they would address in the summer to maybe reconfigure that blue line, but I wouldn't expect anything.
All right, we got a little bit more time with Austin Stanovich of the Sporting Tribune. A little bit more here next on Locked On LA Kings, your team every day. Looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Then you need to crack into a good source of protein with Wonderful Pistachios. Wonderful Pistachios is one of the highest protein nuts with 1 ounce servings, including 6 grams of protein. It gives you over 10% of your daily value, and they are packed with fiber and better for you unsaturated fats to help you feel fuller longer. It's the perfect grab and go snack for a busy day, whether you're at your desk or on a road trip, or just need a quick protein boost. And if you love cracking open every shell for that satisfying crunch, the in-shell option is a classic favorite. Wonderful Pistachios is a complete protein, providing all 9 essential amino acids. Whether you're running between meetings or dropping off the kids, Wonderful Pistachios is the snack that works as hard as you do. Get snackin' and get crackin' with the snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. All right, a little bit more time with Austin Stanovich of the Sporting Tribune. And we mentioned the blue line briefly. There was a report about the Kings being confident in re-signing defenseman Vladislav Gavrikov. I've been saying all year long, I thought he was going to be gone at the end of the year. Certainly looking to cash in on a tremendous season for him. And I thought somebody else would be willing to pay him more than the Kings would be willing to pay. So what do you think about the report of Vladislav Gavrikov perhaps being re-signed by the Kings?
Yeah, I'm not too surprised. I know they really, really like Gavrikov internally. And they think of themselves as a team that could compete and potentially win now. So you typically don't see teams that view themselves that way, letting a guy like Gavrikov go or trying to like sell on him at the deadline. I don't love the number that's being thrown out there for the term on his contract, though. I just don't see how it ends well, giving a guy who's going to be 30 at the start of that in the first season of his contract 7 years. And I really like Vladislav Gavrikov. I think he's been a really good player. He stepped into that role to replace Drew Doughty, as much as anyone can, really well. But at the end of the day, you're talking about giving a second pair defenseman a $6 million plus probably contract through his age 37 season. I just don't. I know the cap's going up, so that's going to change what that what a second pair defenseman's value is. But I just can't see how that's good value for money, giving that long of a contract to a guy at his age. But again, the first 3 to 4 years of that contract, depending on what the money number is, you could be talking about what a great deal was with the Kings, because Gavrikov basically anchors their second pair for, again, at least 4 to 5 years. I think you'll get really good hockey out of him. I would really want that term number to come down. Like 5 is probably the most I'd go with him.
Well, the Kings are riding a 4-game losing skid, and every team goes through their ups and downs. Edmonton certainly is struggling right now. But I've said I'm a little bit concerned about this lately, because when they were in that slump where they weren't scoring, their defense was still there. It just they weren't scoring goals. Lately, we've seen a lot of defensive lapses, and that's the thing that the Kings have really, hung their hat on all year. And that's what really makes them special when they're, at the top of their game. Does it feel a little different to you right now as well, as far as what you're seeing defensively from the team?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say, because, if I'd come on a week ago, we're looking at a team that won 5 of the last 6, was, I think, the highest scoring team in February at that point, just blew the doors off the Vegas Golden Knights. A lot of people were like, oh, maybe they are just a top 6 forward away from getting out of the first round against Edmonton. And a week later, people are talking about maybe they should be a sellout at the deadline. And I think the truth is they're somewhere in between those two teams. I think that, it's almost, to me, this team's almost become boring to me, because we know what they are. They're a good, not great team. They lack elite talent. Like they're going to go through these swings like this. I agree that the defensive coverage has been pretty poor, which is, like you said, something that they hang their hat on. If they don't have that, they kind of don't have anything to fall back on, which is tough. And we talked about the goaltending. Not that I think Darcy Kemper takes any blame for any of these games, but there's maybe some cracks I'm starting to see there, which would be my biggest concern, because I think he is the house of cards for this Kings team. Like, he's put up incredible numbers this season, and if that falls even to average goaltending numbers, I do think this Kings team could be in a little bit of trouble, because he's been fantastic. And if he drops off a little bit, it wasn't as drastic, I don't think, last year. I don't think Cam Talbot's highs were as high, and I don't think Darcy Kemper will get as low, but kind of like Talbot last year, right? Like that, he was an all-star for the first half of the season and then kind of fell back to earth, and wasn't bad for this Kings team, but wasn't great either. And it really, really hurt them down the stretch. And I think the other thing is, as we get deep into the season, I know Jesse Cohen's talked about it before on All the Kingsmen. It is exhausting to defend the way the Kings defend. I mean, you are constantly grinding and battling all night long. And I think as we get deeper into the season, you might start to see that have an effect. Teams are going to start tightening up too and defending better themselves. Like, I do think that could be an issue maybe for this Kings team too, is that they just, because they work so hard every night trying to defend, and it's such a grueling task that it's going to maybe beat them down quicker than other teams are going to be beat down as you go into the playoffs.
He is Austin Stanovich, columnist for the Sporting Tribune, covering the LA Kings. Check out his work at thesportingtribune.com. And if you are on X and Twitter, you need to follow him at @Stanovich68. Austin, it's always enjoyable to talk to you. Always appreciate the insights. It'll be interesting to see what the Kings do or don't do here at the trade deadline. But thanks for sharing your thoughts today. And we will see you out at crypto.com arena soon, I'm sure.
Sounds good, Eddie. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you very much. And I talked to Austin afterwards. The garbage truck's coming just in time as we are wrapping up the show. Thanks, Austin.
Yep.
Austin and I have our dogs with us while we're doing these interviews. And when the garbage truck comes by, sometimes the dog likes to bark. But we're wrapping it up, and we thank Austin for his time. The Kings are back home tonight for the next 5 at home. Hopefully that gets them back on track. It's the St. Louis Blues again. We're going to see them back-to-back games, 7:30 LA time for you everydayers. Those of you that listen and watch Locked On LA Kings every day. Thursday's show, obviously going to be a complete recap of that Kings Blues game. Hopefully some fun things to talk about with that one. If you want to communicate with me and the show and you want to send an email, it's lockedoneddie@gmail.com. Interactive on social media, X, Twitter, Instagram, even TikTok. We're at Locked On LA Kings. I'm Eddie Garcia. Thanks for listening and watching this episode of Locked On LA Kings, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Have a great rest of your day. We'll talk to you tomorrow. And as always, go Kings, go.